So on our fifth point of these eight points on my short list that really sort of define the characteristics of our particular wisdom lineage, it's a bit of a mouthful and a conceptual mouthful, so I'm going to read it straight out to you from the list I scribbled down first on my computer and then unpack it a little. So it goes like this. Also, in contrast to many branches of the wisdom tradition based on perennial or traditionalist metaphysics with its inherently binary and anti-material slant, we are emphatically a Teilhardian, Trinitarian lineage embracing asymmetry, threeness, evolution, and incarnation in all their material fullness and messiness. Huh? What did she just say? Well, let's go back. There's a tendency when we talk about wisdom to use it interchangeably with the term perennial wisdom or Sophia perennis. And the understanding that is that there's an underground stream of wisdom that looks alike as it rolls through all traditions. It's a universal body of truth that all sort of subscribes to the same points, affirms the same realities, has the same sort of qualities and colors. But as I said earlier, right at the beginning of this sort of this talk, is that wisdom really does assume in a very fundamental way the shape of its container. And the containers have very, very different shapes and therefore very different kinds of ambiences and flavors. So Sophia perennius, if you want to call it that as a general category, can be said to be, yes, indeed, the general category that these wisdom streams all belong to. And if you take it in the largest and broadest sense, just to mean this set of basic assumptions about human beings and their spirituality, yes, it's true. And it's in this sense that Richard Rohr is very fond of it and uses it as a kind of cornerstone of the Center for Action and Contemplation Living School to designate something that's deeper, more universal, and more fundamental than the tendency of various paths to get caught in dogmatism. So wisdom is deeper than the catechism, for example. And it's in this very universality that he will use the term perennial tradition or perennial wisdom or Sophia perennis to suggest something that's deeper than doctrine, deeper than possession by one particular dogmatic or religious or sacred stream. And in that sense, certainly, our wisdom stream belongs to the greater tradition of Sophia perennis. The problem is that almost from the first time that this term was used and made popular by Aldous Huxley and others, it had already been kind of essentially possessed by a particular branch of the wisdom tradition, the branch that's often known as traditionalism. The two of them grew up very, very closely intertwined. And traditionalism is a very, very precise and hardcore metaphysical practice and vision of the world. And when you look at it in this hardcore way, based on the traditions, particularly of René Guénon, the great Western Christian interpreter, beginning Christian, he ended as in an Islamic order. And in the whole kind of tradition carried in Chadalida Islam, traditionalism is a very, very specific metaphysic. And it's got some points of clash that are distinctly in tension with the Christian, with the Christian tradition, the lineage at its most expansive and dynamic. And so you can get a really strong cognitive dissonance here. Part of the difficulty with the traditionalist version of Sophia perennis is it's very, very much based on an ancient and kind of binary metaphysic with the idea that materialism is itself dicey, that the journey toward God is spiritualism. It's the classic kind of Neoplatonic binary metaphysic, that the journey is up, away from the coarse materiality of this life. And also, there's a tendency to radically distrust the future, modernity, post-modernity, the whole messy, untidy unfolding. If you're at a traditionalist lecture, you'll almost know that you're there because the first paragraph of the talk will start with some variation of the theme. You only have to look around you to realize that culture is going to hell in a handbasket. And there's this sense that all the traditions, all the innovations that have come in post-modernity, from computers to urbanization to cities to, God forbid, the internet, all of this is going in the wrong direction. And that if we want to find truth and purity, it was vested in the beginnings of the lines. And the way that we have to reorient is to look backwards. And there's often a metaphysic that pushes towards simpler societies, simpler cultures, agrarian organizational patterns based with a spiritual upwelling. And so this kind of a metaphysic, which dominated even in Christianity, admittedly, the whole Neoplatonic strain, is a very, very strong element in Christian mystical utterance. But Christianity in its incarnational heart has always been, at least implicitly, at variance with that, at loggerheads with it. And I remember being very, very grateful for one of my own most esteemed teachers, Bruno Barnhart, who said there's something about the Christian wisdom which is not like the other great wisdom traditions of the world. It has its own gestalt. It has its own imperative that plunges it incarnationally into the world, and sees the future as not something going in the wrong direction, but as the downloading of the new possibilities in an evolving, evolutionary, earthy, validly earthy cosmos. So the threads that we find in Teilhard de Chardin, the threads we find in Jesus' embracing of the body, in Jesus' embracing of the full-fledged incarnational reality, and the threads that we find in that Gurdjieffian strain that I talked about earlier, that give us tools such as the law of three, to say that the direction in which the divine is manifest in this world is not by sucking us back into an eternal spirit, but by birthing ever new and more complex and more intricate and messy forms. The journey is always through matter into new forms, not beyond and up. So you have to be very, very careful in how we're using, you're using the term Sophia Peritus, perennial wisdom, because ours is not a binary and upward-oriented lineage. Ours is one that embraces threefoldness, as we see it in the Trinity, asymmetry, and movement into the world, the basic evolutionary stance, as foundational to our understanding of how love becomes incarnate and present in the world. So that's a very, very important distinction. And as you look around at various things with the title wisdom in it and wisdom schools, it's important to check out very, very carefully what kind of metaphysic they're actually founded on, and to recognize and affirm that our lineage is Trinitarian, Teilhardian, evolutionary, and incarnational. And when these threads disappear, we find that the distinctive features of the Christian mystery disappear along with them. So that point bears directly on point 6, that some who are used to contemplative or contemplative, designating a lifestyle founded in a lot of individual hermit silence in quiet, beautiful buildings, monasteries or hermitages, those that like this will find point 6 challenging. We are moving steadily in the direction of revisioning contemplation, no longer in terms of monastic, otherworldly models, prioritizing silence and repose, but rather as a way of honing consciousness and compassion, so as to be able to fully engage the world and become active participants in its transition to the higher collectivity, the next evolutionary unfolding. In other words, what we're seeing, and this spins off a little bit of point 2 that we made, that we see contemplation as a tool of luminous seeing, not as a lifestyle featuring silence as its most essential memory. The silence, the contemplation, the inner work is the ground for a deeper seeing, and in that seeing, a participation in this evolutionary journey of our planet and of our universe toward the fullness of love. So we recognize that forms change, and we realize that the great spiritual traditions of our world were either born in or reached their definitive statement in what's called the first axial period, that amazing period that struck the world in the years roughly 800 to 200 BCE, in which spontaneously over the world a new sense of being rose up, a new sense of what it means to be an individual in relationship with God. It's the era that birthed the great traditions of Buddhism, the prophets of the Old Testament, Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Lao Tse, all of these people proclaiming the possibility and the imperative of an individual relationship with the sacred realms, the spiritual realms. That all came out of that period. And most of our spiritual practice, and certainly our contemplative practice, is founded on that axial sensibility, meaning that it's first of all geared toward the individual, my individual enlightenment, my individual relationship with God, my individual transformation or redemption. And it's also, in a very powerful way, agrarian-based. It's based on the model of silence, of places of repose, of contemplation, meaning a stepping away from the world into a place which is of a higher subtlety on the spiritual level. So the maps tend to encourage this. But if the model we're reading and that I mentioned in point 5 is it all true, that we're on an evolutionary planetary journey toward the fullness of love, then the teaching that comes particularly out of Teilhard and others is that when the next axial comes, it's not going to look like a bunch of individuals transforming, but that it's going to look like the formation of a new body, a new shape for a common humanity, which is not bottom down, let's just all get together and coexist, but top or not bottom up, but top down. Let's coalesce, let's form a whole new unit with emergent properties, a whole new whole, a higher collectivity in which levels of depth and majesty and beauty of consciousness and compassion become accessible that aren't accessible at the individual level because the individual is too small a unit. So we're talking about a whole new scale and an organization within that scale, a step in the direction of complexification, as Teilhard would call it. And we're seeing that so many of our understandings of spirituality, and particularly contemplative spirituality, are tied to first axial vision and first axial practice. And we understand, just looking around us, that not only is the world changing, but it's taking the old axial institutions right out with them. Monasticism is now hard pushed in almost all the traditions. To get the vocations, to fill the monasteries, people are entering, but they're not staying. Because the rhythm, the energy, the mainstream bed of the channel is flowing through the world. And as you find more and more people who proclaim themselves to be spiritual and not religious, and more people saying that we need to do our practice in the circumstances of daily life, we're seeing a major shift. And many people would lament this as a loss, we see it in our particular line as both a blessing and a challenge. The blessing is because it shows that the contemplation is alive and moving, and wisdom is stirring the pot and pushing us towards new forms to express an ever-evolving sensibility. The challenge is because it forces us to stand and take a big step back and look at even the most powerful institutions, the sacred cows of our lineage, and say, no, we can't look backwards. We can't necessarily trace the place of origin, because the whole history of something developing is also part of its story. And we almost have to look more towards where it's being drawn toward and from to see what the shape is. So we're encouraging people in our lineage to develop the skills and the flexibility and, frankly, the courage to do that. You know, if you meet the Buddha, kill him. The old Buddha saying that sometimes even the old forms won't get you there anymore. Jesus said it, new wineskins for new wine. So we understand the new wineskinny nature of where we are right at this juncture, and we give ourselves to it. It's also the message that we're getting very, very strongly, I would say, from our younger, our millennial contemplatives, who are certainly interested in the tradition, but are pointing out in no uncertain terms that a lot of what we think is eternal truth is culturally bound, is Northern European, ethnocentric, patriarchal, very unreceptive to definitions and inputs from other people in all the corners of the world. And so what we think is an eternal truth is an ethnicity doing its thing. And this is the message that comes to us often so loud and clear from the youngest people coming in. They're saying, okay, we're not buying the whole proposition. And if we get our turn at the helm, we're going to reconfigure the boat a little bit. And I think this is very, very exciting. I remember when I started, back in the contemplative teaching seriously, 20, 30 years ago, you'd look around the room that was 95% middle-aged women who would be lamenting, where are the young people? Where are the people of color? And assuming that the problem was that somehow we weren't getting the message out. So could we go to these young people and tell them and introduce them to the wonders of contemplation? And nowadays we're beginning to see that probably it wasn't that the message wasn't getting out. It was that the content isn't connecting. And as the millennials come, and incidentally they're much more interested in Teilhardian theology, from what we've seen, the scale of the cosmos, the vastness, the dynamism, the movement. That's far more interesting than the rocket ship to the eternal, static, holy one. So they're insisting, and rightly so, that as we approach this axial shift, we have to rethink in a really deep way what are the cornerstones of the lineage we carry? What are the practice? What parts of it that we thought were cornerstones are really only rocks in a moving stream? So this action is very much going on, and I wouldn't say in any sense that it's finished. It's work in progress. But it's work that in our lineage we acknowledge and we affirm and we give ourselves to help. Part of what we see as one of the most sacred tasks of lineage transmission is to work with those who will be receiving what we have in the post, to help create both the space and the firm riverbanks in which real significant innovation becomes possible. And that this talk right here is part of that general transition to try and sort out what really are the important currents, what has been constitutive, what really is more culturally bound in a passing era. But we're up for that conversation. We see that conversation as life-giving and necessary. So that brings us to point 7. And this is a very, very important differentiation and distinction within this general openness to being open to the world, being open to the inputs of the world, being open to the perceptions, the filters that are coming to us. We say, yeah, but you have to realize also where our school stands and what we're charged to do. And as I language this in the 8 bullet points, I language it in the language of Ken Wilber and his color-coded levels of consciousness. So I'm going to come back and unpack that, but I'll read this as I've read the other ones. We are an integral school, not a pluralistic one, to draw on Ken Wilber's levels of consciousness. Our primary mission field is teal, not green. Our work concentrates not at the level of healing the false self, woundedness and recovery, substance abuse, equal rights, restorative justice, or political correctness, although we acknowledge the importance of all these initiatives, but rather at the level of guiding the transition from identity based primarily in the narrative or egoic self to identity stabilized at the level of witnessing presence or permanently or permeably boundaried selfhood. So what I'm saying is that while we're open to the world, we're not an issue-driven school. We're not a school that's working at the identical level of liberation theology, of political correctness, of the Me Too movement, of the various great sweeping social justice movements. We're not working in woundedness and recovery. That's all good work, but it's somebody else's work. That work goes on by and large at what Wilber calls the pluralistic or green level, and is in fact the earmark of that level. And it's important work to do in the world, but since it's work that still is by and large undertaken out of the finite sense of selfhood and the narrative selfhood, it's very vulnerable to the shadow side of all of those really good initiatives in the world. Anger, self-righteousness, burnout, urgency, victimization, violence. All of these things attend as a shadow around work that's done with idealism, but also from a position of what we'd call in our tradition identification. In other words, I'm all over my issue. This is the most important thing. I've got to tell you, we've got to get it right. So this is a tough interface, particularly for the younger, the millennial generation that are coming in, because they're used to seeing contemplation as socially indifferent. And they tend to feel that what their mission is to bring an urgent necessity to raising a consciousness around particularity, minority groups, oppression in all its forms. And what I try to say is that this work is really important, but where we're working is at a different place on that same general initiative. We're all joined in the understanding that the world needs to become a more compassionate place. The world needs to become a more just place. The world needs to become much more unified in its sensitivity to the fact that there are other life forms that we're trampling on. We're all in accord about that. But what the wisdom schools have traditionally attempted to do is shift the center of selfhood out of which we work. The identified self, the narrative self, the urgent, issue-driven self is inevitably going to create resistance and backlash around them. And we've seen over the generations of work and social activism that it rises and falls because it's under the laws of this world. You know, Jacob Boehme, the 17th century mystic, had this mordant line once. He says, "Evil tears down what good builds up, good tears down what evil builds up, and it's all just another useless carving in the great laboriousness of man." So it goes on and on, you know, the social movements, the unjust. But there's another level at which you can work where you directly begin to affect, influence the energetic fields, the matrix, the morphogenetic fields, to use the buzzword, the Rupert Sheldrake term, that we impact the world by a quality of presence, by the quality of attention, and we shift energy and move by not just creating social platforms that are more just, but by directly infusing compassion into a situation at an energetic level. And to be able to do this, and it's a very powerful way to work, you have to carry your selfhood in a different place. You have to move beyond the agenda of healing the false self, finding the true self, stepping beyond all that finite selfhood, and begin to learn to live stably in what the great traditions have called the witnessing self. A self which is more spacious, which has one foot in this realm and one foot in the next, in terms not of heaven after you die, but in terms of the greater cosmic coherence, and can mediate between the two of them. And so you have to take a step back from the issues and the identification they generate in order to begin to stabilize this new selfhood so that it can work. It can do what the Quakers call so beautifully, speaking truth to power. But it does so not out of anger, not out of defendedness, not out of self-righteousness, but out of a greater power, which is the life force of compassion itself, flowing through the realized and permeable person. So we're working to take people across that transition point, partly because we recognize that there's lots of schools and lots of work that are already working at the green level. That work is being done. But without a deeper support and undergirding at the next level down, that level is going to tend to self-destruct. It needs the support of the infinite, of the imaginal, of the non-separated consciousness. And we stand right at that junction between what T.S. Eliot called the timeless and time, and try to help people to walk across that in such a way that they can draw their identity from that which is beyond the ravages of oppression and bring back the repose of that into the political maelstroms of our time, not just for personal comfort in the midst of the hardness, but for subtly changing the nature of objective reality around us. So that's what we're about. And we go through people who occasionally wander into the school very, very politically agitated or committed to something, who are disappointed, who think it looks like we're using politically incorrect language, or why aren't people gagging when we use the man word, or, you know. But it's like, get over yourself. That as long as you're bringing this much bristle and insistence, you're not going to be able to work in the much more spacious and forbearing boundaries in which we try to find this other kind of selfhood and bestow it back toward the world. That's our work, and we need to be very clear about that. We encourage people to yes, stay very closely connected to whatever their post is at the pluralistic level. If you're working in the Black Lives Matter movement, to work there, and to work there with your full heart and soul. But to work there from that position of non-identification and spaciousness and inclusivity that you're learning in the wisdom school, in this lineage. And that's what we're here to teach. That's our post. And we need to be really clear on that, because any attempt to pull the school down into the green level of functioning simply destroys it. We've seen this over and over again as we've tried it. So in my final point, I list some of the people who have been the most important sources, the most important wellsprings in our lineage, the ones we go to as the elders, the sacred texts. And I would say, as I put this list together, that this list is not not comprehensive. It lists the most important ones, the ones that came immediately to mind. And remember, I put these 8 points together fairly quickly. So they're the ones that just smacked me as the biggies. But that doesn't mean that if people are not on the list, we reject them or we don't use them. It doesn't mean that at all. It just talks about the ones that have been the matrix of our lineage. So that if you've read some of these people, if you're drawn to these people, if they speak to you, and if the combination seems somehow or another feasible, comprehensible to you, then you'll probably find the lineage compatible. So at the top of the list, Jesus, our light holder. Saint Benedict, whose rule put together so beautifully in the 5th century, has served as the basis of Christian transformational practice for 1,500 years, and which is still actively observed in the rhythm and structure of our schools. His wisdom, the psychological as well as the spiritual maturity and forgiveness that goes through the rule of Saint Benedict has made it a stable guide for wisdom transformation and a foundation of our work. The canonical and wisdom gospels, alias Gnostical gospels, so that the biblical gospels we read, the whole Bible, as a matter of fact, is sacred scripture for us, but as well we include and embrace those wonderful gospels that I talked about earlier that probably got misnamed, the Gnostic gospels, the wisdom gospels, the transformational gospels and sacred scriptures, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip. These are just some of the ones that are read and studied in our lineage to go deeper into the transformational mind of Christ. The Cloud of Unknowing is a very important one that I call out specifically because I've lived and worked with this medieval text perhaps more than any other text. And I've come to see it not as a manual of medieval piety, but as very rigorous instructions for the movement across that point that I just talked about in the last point, from boundaried narrative sense of selfhood into the spaciousness of a presence which the author describes as dwelling within the cloud of unknowing. A whole different definition of contemplation as a way of knowing within the unknowing. So this is a really important treatise, but the whole greater tradition of Christian mystical and visionary writers has been important, and we gravitate toward the non-dual edge. Meister Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, Thomas Merton, Ladislas Boros. Many of you may never have heard of Ladislas Boros. He wrote this amazing book called The Mystery of Death, which takes Teilhardian vision, refines it, and moves it to the next point to talk about what happens to us when we go through our own death, what happened to Christ when he went through his, and how these two create a beautiful dialectic between the whole and the part. Wonderful book. Bernadette Roberts, that brilliant, singular mystic who died only this past year, whose books, Water's No Self, The Past, The No Self, The Real Christ, and her latest, The Christian Contemplative Journey, really create a benchmark for wisdom and for contemplative experience, I think unsurpassed in this century and maybe in all centuries of Christianity. It doesn't mean she's perfect, but I mean, when she gets it like nobody else gets it. We're informed by the desert and hesychastic traditions, those great wellsprings of Christian practice that tended to grow up in the deserts, in the monastic tradition, but that took the full challenge issued by Jesus: if you would be perfect, sell all you have, give it to the poor, come follow me. And ran with that, ran it down the whole football field. We look at those texts, we work with these texts. We work with the prayer of the heart that came so profoundly out of the hesychastic tradition of the East. And in fact, part of what we come to see in our lineage is that until the mind moves into the heart, as these texts says, not just as a metaphor for getting out of middle calculation and into emotional, but as an actual neurological, physiological drop, so that perception is unified and reoriented out of the heart. Until that happens, you don't understand, and you certainly don't contemplate. So we work with that tradition, where we work with the great Christian Advaitic tradition that grew out of the wake of Bede Griffiths, the Benedictine monk who went to India and there found the other half of his soul. And the wonderful traditions including Raymond Panikkar, Abhishektananda, Bruno Barnhart. They become direct teachers, the one who's in a powerful way faced the Advaitic, the non-dual teachings of the East, and tried to interpret them and live with them and live into them from Western reference points, creating a real synthesis, a real dialogue between two streams of living wisdom. And we're informed by inputs from other traditions. Rumi and the great texts of Sufism are well loved and known. Gurdjieff I've talked about, Teilhard de Chardin I've talked about, and of course I owe always in my own lineage formation a particular gift to my own teacher, Brother Raphael Robin, who put this together for me out of his own lineage and in the cave of his own heart, and passed it on. And what I teach in a very profound way is the living legacy of his remarkable mystical heart. So those are the teachers, those are the elders, the light holders on this path, and those are the 8 points. And as I say once again, I put this out there as an invitation to all of us who are working in this wisdom lineage, who call themselves in some ways students of Cynthia Bourgeault. At this 20-year point, as we've moved through this tradition, to stop and reflect together on where we've come from and what are the most important foundational pieces in this lineage. I certainly expect that it will shift. I would be very happy to see groups sit down, wrestle with these, say, what did you mean by this? What did you mean by this? Challenge, push, adjust. But my point here and my purpose here is to just hand it on in a form that we can actually get it out and look at it, and then hand it over to all of you for dialogue, fine-tuning, and the inevitable metamorphosis and transformation that's part of the evolutionary journey that we say in point 6 that we subscribe to in point 5. So on with the evolution. Let's talk about these points. Let's see if we can collectively own and vision and then reimagine what this wisdom lineage is. So thank you and bless you.